Daniel Mercer was the kind of man people swore by, the police chief who could silence a room with his presence and calm an entire town with a single promise, yet behind the gleaming badge and polished smile was a secret so dark it would one day drag him from the highest pedestal straight into a prison cell he would never leave. In the town of Crestwood, few names carried the weight of Daniel Mercer. He was not only the chief of police, but also a figure carved into the community's sense of pride. People remembered the night he organized the rescue of a kidnapped child, the evening he stopped an armed robbery by walking straight into the line of danger, and the way he stood at public gatherings, shaking hands and smiling like a man who belonged to everyone. For over a decade, Mercer wore his uniform like a promise. Parents told their children that if anything ever went wrong, all they had to do was find the chief and they would be safe. On the surface, Crestwood was quiet, stable, and orderly, and Mercer was the reason people believed it would stay that way. The newspapers adored him. Local journalists ran glowing stories about his bravery and his unshakable moral compass. He was invited to schools to give speeches about honesty and courage. Politicians praised his leadership at community meetings, presenting him as proof that small towns could still have heroes. Even people who had never met him felt like they knew him because Mercer's face was everywhere on television reports, in framed photos at the station, and at charity fundraisers where he was always the guest of honor. He was the man people trusted without hesitation, the man who appeared to dedicate every moment of his life to protecting the place he called home. But what no one in Crestwood realized was that Mercer's success had created more than admiration. It had built a kind of armor around him. That armor wasn't made of metal or Kevlar. It was made of trust. People stopped asking questions when Mercer gave answers because they believed his words were the truth. Judges signed off on his reports without hesitation, assuming he had already looked at every angle. City leaders signed budgets and contracts that Mercer recommended, confident that he had the town's best interest at heart. Even within his own department, younger officers treated him like a father figure, never daring to challenge his decisions. That kind of unquestioned loyalty gave Mercer power far greater than his badge or his title. He could shape the story of Crestwood's safety however he wanted. If a crime was solved, it was his victory. If a case went cold, no one pressed him to explain why. He had the final word on what was true and what wasn't, and with every year that passed, his control grew stronger because the more he was celebrated, the less likely anyone was to believe he could do wrong. Behind the polished speeches and heroic headlines, however, Mercer had already begun to blur the line between protecting the town and protecting himself. At first, it was small favors for friends, bending rules to help allies. Then came the bigger choices, the ones that would have ended another man's career if exposed. Yet Mercer never faced consequences because the people around him could not imagine a world where their chief was anything but honest. They looked at him and saw a savior. He looked back at them and saw the perfect disguise. The peace of Crestwood began to tremble on an autumn morning when a contractor named Robert Lang vanished without explanation. Lang was well known in town, not just for his construction projects, but for his reputation as a stubborn man who refused to be pushed around. He had been working on a new municipal building and had openly complained about the way certain police contracts were being handed out. Most residents brushed off his frustration as typical small-town bickering, but a few weeks later he was gone. His truck was found parked neatly outside his office, keys still inside, and his wallet untouched. Too many. It looked like he had simply walked away, but investigators from outside Crestwood quickly noticed the details didn't add up. The state investigators assigned to the case asked the Crestwood Police Department for Lang's files, specifically his complaints about financial irregularities. Chief Mercer stepped forward with an answer that silenced the room. The files had been misplaced. He explained with confidence that clerical errors sometimes happened, and he promised they would turn up soon. No one in town questioned him. After all, Mercer was the man who had solved countless cases before. If he said the files were missing, people assumed it was nothing more than an accident. But for the investigators who didn't share Crestwood's blind trust, that explanation sounded like the first crack in an otherwise flawless wall. As they pressed harder, they began to find gaps in Mercer's carefully built image. Certain contracts tied to Lang's complaints showed unusual payment patterns. Companies with no clear employees or office spaces were being paid large sums by the police department. When investigators tried to request more documentation, they were told repeatedly that the paperwork had either been lost or would take months to locate. The delays seemed intentional, like roadblocks set up to slow the investigation until interest faded. Inside the department, not everyone was convinced by Mercer's calm reassurances. A rookie officer new to the force and unaccustomed to Crestwood's culture of silence noticed how quickly Mercer dismissed Lang's disappearance. The officer remembered hearing that Lang had been vocal about corruption. It seemed odd that the town's most decorated chief would be so quick to set aside the possibility that foul play was involved. Quietly, the rookie began keeping notes, recording each suspicious instruction and odd dismissal. It was a dangerous decision, one that could end a career if Mercer discovered the truth, but the unease was too strong to ignore. Outside Crestwood, whispers began to circulate. Journalists who had once praised Mercer started to hear rumors that his perfect record was not as perfect as it seemed. Some cases had been closed too quickly with little explanation. Others had evidence that mysteriously vanished before trial. Each question led to more shadows, and the picture of Mercer as an untouchable hero started to blur. The missing contractor was no longer just a single case. It was the thread pulling at the fabric of Crestwood's most trusted institution. For the first time in over a decade, the people of Crestwood were being forced to consider a possibility they had never imagined. What if the man they trusted most was the one with the most to hide, as the search for Robert Lang stretched on? Investigators widened their scope, digging not only into the missing man's last days, but into the very structure of the police department Mercer controlled. What they found at first looked like sloppy accounting, the kind of errors that could be explained away by an overworked city office. But the deeper they dug, the less innocent it appeared. Bank transfers were moving through obscure accounts with no clear recipients. Funds meant for equipment, training, and community programs had quietly disappeared. Millions of dollars over the years had slipped into places no one could trace, all linked by signatures and approvals that came from Mercer's desk. The paper trail alone was damning, but investigators soon discovered that money wasn't the only thing hidden. Acting on a tip, they searched a warehouse on the edge of town, a property registered under the name of one of Mercer's longtime acquaintances. From the outside it looked ordinary, a storage facility with rusted locks and dust on its windows. Inside, it was something else entirely. Stacked high were boxes of evidence that should have been logged at the police department years earlier. Firearms tagged from old crimes, bags of narcotics that never made it to destruction, even personal belongings from individuals who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Many of those cases had been declared solved or closed, and yet here lay the proof that nothing had ever been fully investigated. The discovery shook even the most seasoned investigators. It suggested more than negligence, it suggested control. Mercer had not just been stealing money. He had been shaping the very narrative of crime in Crestwood. By holding on to evidence, he could decide which criminals walked free and which ones were condemned. By hiding drugs and weapons, he could build his own shadow economy, rewarding allies and punishing enemies. The missing contractor was just the surface of something sprawling and deliberate. Records showed that some of the shell companies paid by Mercer's department were directly connected to individuals with criminal histories. These were people who should have been behind bars, yet they were living comfortably, their activities untouched by law enforcement. Mercer's badge had become a shield for them, and in return, they helped build his empire. Deals were struck in the dark, protection in exchange for silence, contracts in exchange for loyalty. Crestwood's stability had not come from safety, it had come from manipulation. The revelations spread quietly at first, whispered among officials and reporters who could hardly believe what they were seeing. How could the man celebrated as a hero for so long be the architect of such corruption, and yet the evidence was undeniable? Every file, every bank record, every hidden box in the warehouse pointed to one truth. Mercer had been living a double life, one polished for the public and one rotting beneath the surface. The weight of the findings grew heavier each day, but the most unsettling part was not what investigators had already uncovered. It was the realization that if Mercer had kept this hidden for more than a decade, then there was likely far more waiting to be discovered. What had begun as a search for one missing man was evolving into the unraveling of a system Mercer had built piece by piece. One lie at a time, Mercer believed that no matter how intense the scrutiny became, he would remain untouchable. His career had been built on a foundation of favors owed, secrets kept, and reputations carefully managed. Over the years, he had cultivated relationships with powerful people who depended on him just as much as he depended on them. Local politicians had secured their positions with his backing. Judges had accepted his recommendations and overlooked questionable evidence. Business owners had received protection in exchange for generous donations. Mercer convinced himself that these ties were too strong for anyone to cut, that his network of influence would shield him from the storm that was beginning to close in. For a while, it seemed to work. Investigators encountered delays at every turn. Witnesses who had agreed to speak suddenly refused. Files they requested were misplaced. Even county officials who had once been outspoken about corruption in other departments suddenly turned silent when Mercer's name came up. It was as though an invisible hand kept pushing against the truth, keeping it buried just out of reach. Mercer watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction, confident that his powers still stretched farther than anyone could see. But behind the walls of the Crestwood Police Department, a fracture was growing. The rookie officer who had been quietly keeping notes had already reached out to investigators months earlier. At first, the officer's information was treated cautiously. After all, Mercer's reputation was formidable. Yet, as more details emerged, it became clear that this officer was offering something invaluable. Meetings were arranged in secret. The rookie was outfitted with a wire, instructed to gather everything possible from the man everyone thought was uncheckable. The recordings captured more than investigators dared hope for. On tape, Mercer could be heard giving orders to bury files, redirect funds, and threaten those who asked too many questions. He spoke freely, never imagining that the very conversations he had relied on to enforce loyalty were now forming a case against him. The words were chilling, not because of their volume, but because of their casualness. To Mercer, these crimes had become routine, part of the daily rhythm of maintaining control. Meanwhile, state and federal authorities pieced together the evidence with growing confidence. What had once seemed like scattered anomalies now connected into a larger, unmistakable pattern of organized crime. Mercer had not been a man reacting to corruption, he had been orchestrating it. Every step, from the missing contractors' files to the evidence warehouse, fit into the framework of an empire he had built under the town's nose. When the moment of arrest came, Crestwood was caught in shock. Federal agents entered the police station on a crisp morning, their presence impossible to ignore. Officers who had once saluted Mercer stepped back in silence as he was handcuffed in front of them. He tried to maintain composure, shoulders square and face steady, but as the charges were embezzlement, racketeering, obstruction, conspiracy, and ties to unsolved disappearances, the cracks showed. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in years, he was no longer in control. The empire Mercer had built through intimidation, silence, and deception was collapsing around him, not with a single dramatic explosion, but piece by piece, like a fortress crumbling from within. And as the truth finally broke through, It became clear to everyone watching that the chief they had trusted had been living a life so vast that even prison walls might not be enough to contain its shadow. The trial of Daniel Mercer became a national spectacle, the kind of case that drew cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers from across the country. For Crestwood, it was something else entirely. The town that had once celebrated Mercer as its savior now gathered in disbelief, waiting to hear the details of the crimes that had been carried out in their name. Courtrooms were packed with residents, families of victims, and former allies who could no longer deny the weight of the evidence. Each day revealed new pieces of a story that seemed too dark to be true. Prosecutors built their case methodically, starting with the financial crimes. They traced stolen funds through layers of shell companies, showing jurors how millions intended for community safety had instead lined Mercer's pockets and financed his criminal network. Spreadsheets, bank statements, and falsified contracts were projected on large screens, each one bearing Mercer's signature. The image of the noble chief began to dissolve, replaced by the portrait of a man who had treated public trust as a personal business. Then came the warehouse. Jurors listened in silence as investigators described finding evidence that should have been secured years ago. Families of missing persons sat in the gallery with tears streaming down their faces as personal belongings were displayed: watches, purses, and photographs that had vanished along with their loved ones. Each item was more than just a piece of evidence. It was a reminder of lives that had been stolen, cases that had been declared hopeless, while Mercer quietly locked the truth away. The most devastating blow arrived in the form of the recordings. Jurors heard Mercer's own voice giving instructions that could not be mistaken. He spoke about making problems disappear, about shifting money into safe channels, about controlling who was allowed to rise and who was destined to fall. The words were plain, spoken with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was beyond reach. The jury listened not to speculation or theory, but to the chief's own commands, captured in cold detail. Witness after witness stepped forward, some reluctantly, others eager to finally speak freely. Former officers admitted to following questionable orders. City officials described being pressured to sign documents without explanation. Even those who once praised Mercer were forced to concede that the man they trusted had manipulated them at every turn. With each testimony, the illusion of the honorable chief unraveled further until nothing remained but the stark reality of his crimes. The verdict, when it came, was swift, guilty on every charge. Mercer stood without expression as the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted with emotion, relief, grief, anger, and disbelief. Some wept openly, others shook their heads in silence. Mercer himself lowered his gaze, the weight of finality pressing down on him in a way that even he could not defy. For Crestwood, the outcome was both justice and tragedy. Their greatest protector had been revealed as their greatest betrayer. The man who once wore the badge as a shield now faced a future defined by prison walls. And in that final moment, as he was led away in shackles, the truth settled over the town like a shadow that would never fully lift. The chief who had built his life on control and deception realized, too late, that he would never walk free again.